in the heart of the Pacific, where jungle shadows swallowed entire battalions, one American soldier carried a rifle every officer laughed at. They called it a toy. They called it a mistake. But on Guadalcanal's blood-soaked ridges, that mistake began rewriting the fate of men who were supposed to die. In a war ruled by firepower, a single bolt-action weapon and the quiet man behind it would force history to hold its breath. In the dripping silence before dawn on Guadalcanal, the jungle breathed like a living thing. Slow, damp, and waiting. Lieutenant Marcus Ellery, with mud soaking through his worn fatigues, lifted a rifle his fellow officers had dismissed with smirks and sideways glances. To them it was nothing more than a polished toy, a misplaced sporting piece, brought into a world built on steel, grit, and regulation. Yet in this gray sliver of morning, as the mist clung to the fronds around him, that rifle steadied his heartbeat. It was the only familiar truth he carried into a place where everything else felt uncertain. Ellery had not come to the South Pacific as a man expecting admiration. At 27, with the quiet precision of a Midwestern shooting champion, he carried a temperament that made louder men uncomfortable. Before the war, he had filled state fairgrounds with a hush of crowds watching him carve tight clusters into paper targets at impossible distances. Now, among the worn faces of the 132nd Infantry, that history meant little. Combat had ground down the first waves that landed months before, leaving the Army to reinforce a campaign the Marines had bled to hold. Out here, reputations died quickly, especially those that didn't arrive wrapped in combat citations. His Winchester Model 70 had arrived only days earlier, weeks overdue, its grease-sealed crate finally dragged from a supply pile at Kukum. Ellery had saved for 2 years to buy it an indulgence, according to his battalion's senior officers. The Garand, they argued, was the only rifle a soldier needed. Gas-powered, rugged, and born for war, but Ellery knew the difference between a good tool and the right one. The Winchester carried no battlefield pedigree, only the flawless lines of a civilian precision weapon. Yet its action was smooth enough to quiet his mind. Its barrel honed to send a single round exactly where his eye demanded. He trusted it, the way a craftsman trusts the weight of a bistum. Chisel it felt like an extension of his judgment. That judgment was exactly why the battalion had allowed him to try. Japanese marksmen had turned the banyan thickets of Point Cruz into a gauntlet, killing Americans every day with shots so precise they left the men frozen in place long after the sound faded. 11 confirmed hidden shooters, maybe more, each one tucked into shadowed angles under the immense canopy. They waited for movement, helmets glinting, elbows shifting, a canteen lifted at the wrong moment. Marines advancing through that sector had grown accustomed to loss measured in single rifle cracks. Ellery's commanding officer had agreed, reluctantly, to let him prove his rifle in combat. The permission felt less like confidence and more like a wager. If he succeeded, the battalion might breathe a little easier. If he failed, the blame could rest squarely on the rifle so many had mocked. Either way, it would not be the Garand's reputation on the line. The night before the test, Ellery worked beneath the dim flame of a rationed tin lamp. He stripped cosmoline from the bolt and barrel, letting the oil run over his fingers until the action cycled with a whisper. He tightened the scope mounts by sense alone, grounding the screws until they felt like part of the steel. From his kit he pulled the small box of hand-loaded rounds, carefully measured powder, uniform cases, bullets seated with almost loving exactness. Kneeling in the shadows of the makeshift tent, he examined each cartridge one last time. The jungle rustled outside in low, restless murmurs, as if impatient to see whether this foreign rifle could alter the rhythm of death it had established. By the time he reached the ruined bunker at Point Cruz before sunrise, the air had thickened into a damp cloak around him. The 132nd Infantry had carved this foothold from ground the Marines had taken at terrible cost. Sandbags slumped at odd angles, riddled by weather and time. The bunkers, cracked concrete walls smelled of mildew and lingering smoke. It was a place defined by what had already happened. Quiet now, but pulsing with memory. Ellery settled into the bunker with deliberate stillness. He placed his Winchester on a ledge of broken concrete and adjusted the narrow crosshairs over the edge of the forest. The tree line lay 240 yards ahead, its shadows layered like folded cloth. Far above, the banyan branches interlocked, creating a ceiling of green that trapped the dawn light in fractured, hazy bands. He inhaled until his pulse steadied. This was not a shooting range. Targets here did not wait. They watched. Officers in the rear believed this morning would answer a question about a rifle's capability. Ellery knew better. The test had nothing to do with wood grain or a bolt's smooth throw. It was about patience, the kind honed over years of quiet Midwest mornings where he had learned to let minutes pass without shifting, without blinking, without surrendering. Focus. The snipers, hidden beyond the trees, believed themselves the masters of waiting. Today, he intended to challenge that belief. The sun edged upward, casting a faint gold line through the canopy. The jungle remained motionless, suffocatingly still. Ellery kept his cheek against the stock, breath shallow, eyes locked on a patch of brush where earlier patrols had sensed something wrong. His muscles twitched once, but he forced them into submission. Nothing moved. Then, just as the humidity pressed hardest against his lungs, a single branch near the tree line shifted so slight it could have been the weight of dew or a passing bird. But it wasn't. Ellery felt the moment like a tightening thread. The question waiting in that movement wasn't about the rifle after all. It was sharper, colder, and far more personal. It was whether he could outweight death itself. At exactly 9:17 a.m., in the suffocating hush of Point Cruz's banyan grove, a single glint flickered high in the canopy. To most men, it would have been an illusion, a trick of sunlight through swinging leaves. But to Lieutenant Marcus Ellery, it was the kind of detail that never arrived by accident. His breath settled. His pulse slowed into a practiced rhythm. That faint shard of light marked the opening moment of a private war between two unseen men, both hidden, both patient, and both willing to gamble their lives on stillness and precision. Ellery eased his cheek against the cool steel of the Winchester and let the Lyman Alaskan scope gather the world into a tight circle. The glint resolved into the subtle curve of metal nestled in a chamber of tangled branches nearly 90 feet above the forest floor. Within that narrow cradle of woven limbs, a shape shifted. It was small, almost insignificant to any soldier who hadn't learned to read silence like a language. Ellery tightened his focus, exhaled with deliberate slowness, and allowed instinct to guide his timing. A firm, steady squeeze completed the motion. Through the scope, he saw the shape detach from the branches and drift downward, swallowed by layers of leaves, before reaching the ground beyond his sight. No sound followed, no cry, no frantic movement. Just a heavy, unnatural stillness that replaced the tension the way fog consumes sunlight. It was the kind of silence soldiers rarely spoke about, the kind that came not from peace, but from the abrupt removal of danger. Ellery felt its weight settle into him with unnerving clarity. Minutes passed before the second sign appeared. This time, it was movement along a thick banyan trunk, subtle but steady, as if another sniper was descending in search of escape. The figure moved with practiced caution, nearly blending into the mottled bark. Ellery's heartbeat slowed again, this time syncing with the rhythm of calculation, distance, angle, timing. He shifted his aim fractionally, understanding how gravity and motion would guide the moment. Another measured breath, another controlled squeeze, and the figure's hold on the trunk loosened. Branches stirred as the body slipped through them, absorbed by the deep green shadows below. Ellery felt a quiet recognition begin to unfold within him. The transformation wasn't abrupt, nor fueled by adrenaline. It was steadier, almost solemn. He had entered the grove as a disciplined marksman, defined by precision and restraint. But in the dim light of the banyan forest, he felt something sharper awaken an instinct, shaped not by competitions or measured scoring rings, but by the immediate reality of men whose survival depended on invisible duels played out above their heads. He was no longer just a rifleman. He was becoming something more primal, more attuned to the hidden rhythm of the battlefield. Back at the perimeter, Stunned whispers began to spread. Soldiers who had once dismissed Ellery's Winchester now traded quick, incredulous glances. Word drifted from foxhole to command post. The lieutenant with the sporting gun had turned the Banyans into a domain where he alone seemed capable of reading the danger. Rumors spread faster than facts. But even the most skeptical men felt a shift in their understanding. Whatever judgment they had cast on Ellery's weapon no longer held weight. Respect, not admiration, but something closer to reverent disbelief began to settle around his name. The hours that followed tested a different kind of endurance. Ellery remained fixed in the bunker, his world reduced to the crossing lines of his scope, the measured cadence of his breathing, and the subtle cues hidden in the layered branches. The psychological strain pressed against him, gnawing at the fragile line between patience and exhaustion. Every shift of the wind, every sway of vines, every abrupt rustle deep in the canopy demanded scrutiny. He had to measure distance, not with tools, but with instinct, aligning judgment with the ebb and flow of the grove's natural movements. Just after midday, the tree line snapped alive with sudden danger. A sharp burst of energy cut through the air, and sandbags beside Ellery erupted in a spray of dust and fibers, torn apart by a shot meant for him. He felt the shock in his chest, not from impact, but from the realization of how narrowly he had avoided becoming another silent casualty beneath the trees. He steadied himself, resisting the urge to duck or retreat deeper into the bunker. He let stillness be his shield instead. He scanned, with renewed focus, following faint clues through the entanglement of light and shadow. It took nearly a full minute before he spotted it, the faint outline of a figure perched 73 feet above the ground, blended into the dark curves of the upper canopy. The silhouette was subtle, almost ghost-like, but unmistakable once seen. Ellery prepared for the duel with a calmness that surprised even him. He aligned the crosshairs, exhaled, and released the shot. The silhouette dissolved from its perch, lost to the jungle's layers in a descent as quiet as the others. By noon, 5 hidden snipers had been silenced, each removed not through force, but through steady judgment and unwavering composure. The banyan grove grew quieter than it had been in weeks. Even the usual chorus of insects seemed cautious, as though the forest itself were recalibrating to the absence of its silent hunters. But Ellery felt no triumph, only the creeping awareness that the enemy would adapt. They were watching, learning, adjusting their tactics in ways that made the silence feel heavier. As the sun dipped behind Point Cruz, stretching long shadows across the grove, Ellery recognized something unsettling. The quiet that now settled over the banyan forest was not victory's calm. It was anticipation, the kind that hinted at an opponent, preparing for a new kind of duel, one shaped not by visible movement, but by strategy and revenge. And tomorrow, they would come for him. The sky over Point Cruz split open without warning, releasing a wall of tropical rain so fierce it felt as though the island itself had cracked. Thunder rolled across the canopy in long, trembling waves, and water hammered the banyan grove with a violence that swallowed every familiar sound. Lieutenant Marcus Ellery, who had spent the previous day turning the treetops into his battleground, felt the shift immediately. The hunter who had ruled the shadows now became a silhouette exposed in a storm that distorted distance, muffled movement, and smothered vision to barely 100 yards. The air smelled of soaked earth and fractured leaves, as if everything had been stripped to its rawest form. Rain pooled inside what remained of his bunker, turning its concrete floor into a shallow, soupy mirror that reflected flashes of lightning. Ellery checked his Winchester with disciplined calm, wiping moisture from the scope, though the effort felt futile. The storm reduced clarity to fractured glimpses. Targets appeared briefly between blurred curtains of water, then vanished again. But he remained still, listening for what rain could not hide patterns of movement. The shift of weight against soaked branches, the subtle rhythm of someone searching for him. At 0912, through a gap where the rain briefly thinned, he caught sight of a shape far beyond his usual engagement range. It was barely a suggestion of form, shoulder, arm, the faintest tilt of a rifle positioned more than 290 yards out. The enemy had learned from the previous day. They had retreated to greater distances, trusting the storm to mask their presence. Ellery let instinct replace precision. He slowed his breath, estimating the sway of the rain, the wind's pull across the tree line, and the motion of a target that believed itself secure. When he took the shot, the recoil felt heavier than usual, muted under the roar of the storm. The shape collapsed, its fall swallowed instantly by rain and mud. That moment confirmed what both sides already understood. Adaptation defined survival now. Ellery had no time to remain still. Minutes after the shot, the jungle trembled with a new threat. Mortars began to fall in brutal succession, their explosions growing steadily closer as Japanese spotters triangulated the origin of his firing position. The first blast shattered the outer sandbags and sent water surging across the floor. The second ripped through the roof's far corner, showering debris across his shoulders. He did not wait for the third. With mud splashing up to his knees, he sprinted through the flooded grove, the sound of incoming shells chasing him in a rising crescendo. Behind him, the bunker he had used for 2 days vanished beneath a plume of earth and shattered concrete. He reached a fallen tree, its massive trunk resting diagonally across a patch of churned mud, and slid into position along its sheltered angle. Rain drummed against the bark like a steady march. From this improvised perch, he scanned the tree line again, adjusting to a landscape that felt entirely changed. The storm had transformed the battlefield into a shifting maze. But Ellery adapted with a clarity sharpened by necessity. By late afternoon, despite the storm's relentless assault, he had spotted and neutralized 2 more concealed snipers. Each shot required not only skill, but a near-intuitive grasp of how rain altered sound, visibility, and the timing of threat. When word reached Captain Edward Norris, the officer's reaction carried none of the skepticism that had shadowed Ellery's arrival on Guadalcanal. Norris approached through the slick mud with a gravity that matched the storm. He understood the significance of Ellery's impact. Casualties had dropped sharply. Movement in the grove had become possible again, and patrols once trapped by fear could advance with renewed confidence. With quiet conviction, Norris assigned Ellery to permanent sniper operations, acknowledging that no other soldier on the island had shaped the battle's trajectory with such precision. For the first time, Ellery stood not as a curiosity with a sporting rifle, but as a strategic asset. The following day arrived with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the grove washed clean but deeply unsettled. Every tree seemed to glisten with potential threat, every vine a possible screen for watching eyes. Ellery moved deliberately through the undergrowth, feeling the tension of a new tactic forming in the air. The enemy had studied him closely, and what he encountered next confirmed their evolving strategy. He spotted a sniper positioned low in a palm, an unusual choice, almost too obvious. The placement felt wrong, too exposed, as though it had been staged for an observer. Ellery paused, letting instinct probe the scene. Then he saw it. A second figure, high above in a banyan, almost directly behind the decoy, concealed with far more care. The trap was elegantly crafted. The first sniper, placed low, was meant to lure him into a predictable angle. The real threat waited above, prepared to strike the moment Ellery committed to the decoy. He refused the invitation. Instead, he reversed the order. His first shot eliminated the decoy with swift precision. As expected, the hidden sniper shifted ever so slightly in response, just enough to betray its position. Ellery transitioned instantly, placing his crosshairs on the true threat and firing before the enemy could capitalize on their ambush. The Banyans stirred faintly, then quieted. Seconds later, enemy machine guns tore into the position he had occupied moments earlier, shredding bark, soil, and foliage with a storm of fire. The air shook with the assault. Ellery remained low, breath controlled, understanding how narrow the margin between life and death had become. He crawled toward a crater filled with rainwater, sliding into its muddy depths until only his Winchester's barrel protruded above the crowed surface. The world around him vibrated with tension, every instinct sharpened. Something was moving not above him in the branches, but through the mud itself, inching toward him with a stealth that felt almost unnatural. The hunter was no longer alone. A different kind of tension settled over Point Cruz as the fourth morning rose through a mist that clung low to the ground. It was the kind of quiet that carried the weight of unfinished business, and Lieutenant Marcus Ellery felt it in the rhythm of the soaked earth beneath him. The Banyan duels had thinned the enemy's hidden ranks, and the storm had scattered their patterns, but one figure still moved through the grove with unsettling intention. This last survivor of Japan's sniper corps was no ghost high in the branches. He had abandoned the canopy entirely. He was already on the ground, adapting faster than the rest, hunting Ellery with deliberate steps shaped by patience and precision. Ellery sensed the shift in tactics before he saw any sign of the man. The usual hints, like glints, small branch shifts, did not appear. Instead, there were faint impressions in the mud, barely formed, as though someone had studied how rain erased evidence and learned to leave even less behind. He studied the terrain carefully, noting how certain rocks along a low ridge seemed slightly darker, as if recently disturbed. As he observed, a shape emerged briefly among them, a visible sniper positioned deliberately where an American might expect danger. The placement was too clean, the angle too defined. Ellery recognized it instantly as a distraction engineered for someone who had learned to read the grove with the same instinct he now relied on. The real threat appeared 70 yards to the northwest, just a fleeting suggestion of form, half shielded by vines and positioned along a narrow escape corridor. The enemy had crafted a two-man deception, one sniper to draw the eye and the other to cover the route any cautious soldier might take. Ellery understood the trap before it closed. The pair moved with a coordination that spoke to training and survival, advancing through the grove in a slow, controlled rhythm, each movement designed to corner the lone American, who had disrupted their ranks. Ellery sank deeper into the flooded crater where he had taken refuge the night before. Cold water reached his chin as he pressed himself lower, allowing only his Winchester's barrel to rest above the surface. Rainwater carried the metallic scent of mud, old leaves, and spent tension. He held himself perfectly still for 10 long minutes as the two enemy snipers advanced. Their footfalls softened by mud, they passed so close he could hear their cautious breathing, their slow assessment of the terrain, their expectation that their prey was already moving away. When the moment arrived, it was not one shaped by speed or force, but by timing. Ellery rose only enough to align his rifle and break the deception. The first shot found the visible sniper, dropping him before he could react. The second turned instinctively toward the hidden operator, eliminating the threat before the man could register the shift. The grove fell quiet again and unsettled, almost suspended, calm, in the wake of a duel defined not by force, but by judgment. Then the silence changed. Footsteps approached, not careful, trained ones, but heavier movements made by several people at once. A 6-man infantry patrol pushed through the trees, their voices low but rushed, carrying urgency shaped by the sudden loss of their last sharpshooters. Ellery remained in the crater, the water rising again as thin runoff flowed toward him. He had no way to relocate without revealing his position. The patrol spread out, drawing closer in tightening arcs. He felt the pulse in his throat shift from calm rhythm to something heavier, something shaped by suffocating proximity. The first soldier stepped so near the crater's edge that mud slid into the water beside Ellery's arm. In that cramped hollow where movement risked discovery, Ellery fought to keep thought ahead of instinct. The moment unfolded not as a wild struggle, but as a series of deliberate choices made under extreme pressure. When the patrol closed over the crater, Ellery acted with the same restraint he had used in the trees. 3 soldiers fell in rapid succession, each decision shaped not by aggression, but by the necessity to break their tightening formation. Mud splashed, the grove erupted in startled shouts, and Ellery used the sudden confusion to push free of the crater. He slipped into the undergrowth before the remaining men could regroup. Their hurried attempts to track him became lost in the tangled mix of vines and rain-soaked branches. Exhaustion pressed against his ribs with every movement, and each step felt heavier than the last. His ammunition had dwindled, leaving him dangerously close to empty, and the ground ahead offered little shelter. Yet the instinct that had carried him through 4 days of tense, controlled engagements guided his retreat northward. He kept low, reading each cluster of roots and each break in the canopy, moving with the last reserve of discipline he possessed. By the time he reached the American perimeter, His uniform was streaked with mud, his rifle weighed down by moisture, and his muscles trembled from strain. Medics moved toward him initially, but Ellery waved them aside long enough to deliver the only report that mattered. 11 confirmed snipers, an entire network that had controlled the Banyan Grove, were gone, silenced over 4 days of relentless adjustment and measured calm. Word traveled quickly across the regiment. Soldiers recognized not only the magnitude of Ellery's achievement, but the precision and restraint that had shaped it. His commanding officers gathered with new purpose, no longer viewing the Winchester as an anomaly, but as the foundation of a capability the Army lacked. Orders arrived swiftly. Lieutenant Ellery was to establish and train a specialized sniper unit, drawing on the discipline that had kept him alive in a world where stillness meant survival. As he stood before the mixed collection of rifles, scopes, and uncertain young faces that awaited instruction, the weight of the task settled over him. 40 rifles, 14 scopes, one exhausted man. The Army wanted him to teach others how to become ghosts. The air in India's Lido foothills carried a different kind of weight than Guadalcanal's heavy heat. It was warmer, thicker, more patient in the way it slid between leaves and stones, as if it meant to study every man who crossed through it. Lieutenant Marcus Ellery felt that scrutiny on the day he arrived, wearing a fresh uniform that did little to disguise the exhaustion carved into him by months of jungle fighting. The Army had summoned him across oceans for a single purpose. The man who had changed the course of a battle with one rifle was now expected to teach others how to disappear inside the foliage of another continent. The hills seemed to watch him, curious to see whether the lessons born in the Banyans could survive in this new wilderness. He was handed an assembly of 40 soldiers, experienced marksmen, each coming from different units, all handpicked for steadiness and discipline. Their equipment, however, revealed how far the Army still lagged behind the needs of modern jungle warfare. The rifles issued for the new sniper course were refurbished Springfields, fitted with long unertl scopes, their polished tubes glinting in the sun like leftover relics from an earlier war. Ellery accepted them without complaint, but he made one point clear. His Winchester would remain his personal weapon. It had become not merely a tool, but a record of every decision that had kept him alive. The Army granted the exception without hesitation, recognizing that the rifle was as much a part of his instruction as any guideline he would teach. Ellery began shaping the first American jungle sniper training course with the same patience he had once used while watching treetops for silent killers. He designed the regimen around the realities he had lived, where vision narrowed to slivers, where breath dictated timing, and where movement was less a tactic than a liability. Each morning, he trained the men to manage their breathing in humidity so thick it clung to their lips. Afternoons were spent teaching them how to read wind through leaves rather than flags, to judge angles not by grids but by the bend of branches, and to weave camouflage so natural that sunlight passed over them without pause. He introduced the 2-man rotation doctrine, one shooter, one observer, born from the knowledge that no sniper fought alone in the jungle. The observer learned to measure sound and shadow, to whisper adjustments, to see danger before the shooter ever raised his weapon. Ellery drilled them in silence, in patience, in the knowledge that precision weighed more than firepower. Under his instruction, they began to move through the vegetation like fragments of the forest itself. By the time they were deployed west of the Matinee Cow, the sniper section had become something unprecedented in the Army structure. They advanced through ravines and thickets, where patrols once hesitated, slipping into positions no larger unit could safely reach. Over the course of weeks, they cleared the last Japanese holdouts in the region, 74 confirmed kills. Each one delivered with calm coordination. The most remarkable number, however, was the one that mattered least to headquarters reports, but most to Ellery. 0 casualties. Their survival affirmed what he had always believed. Precision could outlast fear, and discipline could outthink force. But the war carried its own momentum, and it eventually swept Ellery into its next theater. A wound from a mortar fragment forced his evacuation from the front, pulling him reluctantly from the men he had trained. After recovery, he was reassigned to Merrill's Marauders in Burma, a campaign defined not by sweeping offensives, but by grueling marches through miles of tangled terrain, where hunger and disease claimed more energy than enemy bullets. Here, sniper work changed shape. Engagements were fewer, distances shorter, and time spent waiting longer. Ammunition came in limited supply, often rationed to ensure every shot carried purpose. Ellery recorded only 3 sniper kills during the Burma operations, but each one reaffirmed the lesson that had guided him since his first duel in the Banyans. Skill survived where weapons faltered. The conditions were harsher, the marches longer, the exhaustion deeper, yet the clarity he carried through each moment remained unshaken. By the end of his service, the rifle felt more like a chronicle than an instrument, preserving the weight of every decision made in silence. After the war, Ellery's knowledge did not fade into obscurity. He returned to Fort Benning, where he taught marksmanship to young recruits who had never known the suffocating darkness of jungle canopy. He wrote about discipline and patience, framing his lessons not as tales of victory, but as reflections on craft, humility, and the quiet responsibility carried by those who watched from hidden places. His book, Shots Fired in Silence, fictionalized to avoid retelling classified operations, became a testament to the belief that control and restraint mattered as much as courage. Years later, his Winchester Model 70 found its way into a museum exhibit. It sat behind glass, its walnut stock polished by use, not ceremony. Visitors passed it every day, pausing briefly before moving on to larger displays, tanks, flags, artillery. The rifle appeared ordinary, just another piece of wood and steel in a room full of relics. What they didn't know was this: one man's steady breath in a distant jungle had changed how America fought forever. If stories like this one remind you how quiet courage can reshape a war, stay with us and lend your voice to keeping these forgotten heroes alive. Your support pushes these untold battles back into the light. But before you go, ask yourself something. If you were handed a weapon the world mocked, would you trust it enough to change destiny or walk away? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your truth.